we should always be trying non-lethal methods to deter wildlife from being in the community. Absolutely, that should always be the first step.
This is Defender Radio. I'm Michael Howie, and this is Defender Radio, the podcast for wildlife advocates and animal lovers, brought to you by the Fur Bearers. I have news. Sort of. I'll have news next week when I have a bit more time. I'm late getting this episode up because earlier today there were some dogs running around my neighborhood after escaping from their home when a contractor left the door open. And JJ and I helped corral them away from the 5 lanes of traffic they ran into a few times. However, this interview you're about to hear, I absolutely love doing. Luci is wonderful, and I cannot wait to have her on the show again. And maybe, if we get a little bit of peer pressure going here, we can have her show up with some content over at youngdefenders.ca. But for now, remember to follow me on social media at Defender Radio for Facebook and Twitter, and at Howie Michael for Instagram to get updates on what I'm up to. So now, let's get into this very important topic. Bears are dying in British Columbia as spring turns to summer. I'd love to have a cute, chipper way of introducing this interview, but that's the sad fact. Largely due to poor attractant management, bears wander into communities in search of easy meals. An inconsistent response from various residents results in their ongoing presence in the community, and, eventually, it often leads to conservation officers killing the bear for alleged habituation. It doesn't need to be this way. Luci Cadman of the North Shore Black Bear Society in BC works tirelessly to educate communities and push for enforcement of existing bylaws regarding attractants and the human behavior that leads to these conflicts. She joined Defender Radio to discuss the reality of living near bears, the things individuals and whole communities can do to stop this killing, and why this isn't a bear issue, but a human one. Let's dive in. Let's start with what the North Shore Black Bear Society is. What's the story there?
Well, the society was founded as a network in 1999, and that was after, in 1 year on the North Shore, which is North and West Vancouver, so not a huge space, 40 bears were killed in just 1 year. And so a network was organized, and residents were saying, we need to do something about this. It was all based around garbage. So they had people doing night patrols, doing garbage checks and such. And then I believe it was in 2005 became a society. So we received funding from all 3 North Shore municipalities. And we do accept honorarium too to help fund our education programs. So a few of the things that we do, we accept calls, emails, reports to our website. So that's attractant sightings if people see their neighbors leaving garbage out overnight. We've got solid waste bylaws here in the district of North Vancouver and in West Vancouver to protect wildlife. So those bylaws state that you can't have your garbage out overnight. It has to be placed at curbside in the morning of collection only. So there are fines applicable for that, of course. In the district of North Vancouver, it's $100, and then in West Vancouver, it's $150. So we have volunteers. We've got 2 paid staff members. So it's myself, I'm the education coordinator, and then Christine Miller, who's our executive director, and she's been the face of the society for many, many years now. So we've kind of switched roles, and I'm doing all the outreach, and Christine works on the relationships that we have within municipality, bylaw, solid waste, and the Conservation Officer Service. We place signs, too, across the North Shore. So in West Vancouver, we connect with the Parks Department, who will place the signs for us, but in the district and the city of North Vancouver, we've got volunteers that will place bear in area signs, and we typically leave those up for 2 or 3 weeks to let residents know a bear's recently been in the neighborhood and what their responsibilities are, and of course then what to do if they have an encounter with the bear. That's what the signs say. And we write to everybody that buys a house here. So we've got tons of renters, and we're trying to figure a way to get in touch with those people. But everybody that buys a house, we write to them, and we welcome them to Bear Country, and we let them know how it works here and our responsibilities to not tempt wildlife into the neighborhood. We spend a lot of time in schools. Oh my goodness, I've spent so much time in school this year. It's been great. I think I've got to almost 6,000 students in schools.
Wow.
So I usually go for the whole day. It's so much fun. This is all so new to me, right? as I said, I'm a shy person. I didn't know anything about kids and speaking to kids, but my partner's a teacher, elementary school teacher, so she's helped me a lot with that, and it's just such a wonderful experience speaking to those young open minds, and they have so many great questions, and they really think outside the box, and it's really awesome. So I think I've spoken to 5,000-6,000 students this year. So as I said, it's elementary school mainly, and I'll go in for the day, and they just keep bringing the grades in. And do lots of presentations to newcomers to Canada, people like me. So I moved here from England 5 years ago because I love wildlife and I wanted to be closer to wildlife. And I didn't understand when I moved here the consequences for wildlife when they're in an urban environment. So I picked this house as close to the forest as I could get, as high up, as far away from as people as possible. And then there was a bear and area sign on my street, and I was like, amazing, this is great. I've moved to the right place. I'm so desperate to see all these animals. And that's when I learned about the consequences for bears when they're sighted in the neighborhood, and that's what got me in with the society. And so I volunteered with them for a year, and my role kind of evolved from there.
Well, that's great. I mean, there's a lot there, I think. So first thing I want to talk about is unpacking all of the different people you have to work with. This is something that I think a lot of folks don't realize. When we're talking about wildlife issues, you would think it's a straightforward thing. It's, oh, well, you talk to the province, and the province is in charge of wildlife, and they're going to have a person, and that person's going to tell you what you need to know, and that's the end of it. But in my experience for several years working in wildlife advocacy, and before that for 12 years or so as a journalist, I never came across a single government office that could actually wholly control a situation. And when we're talking about wildlife, there's so many moving parts. How long did it take you, do you think, or what is it like, more particularly, trying to both keep in your head all of these different moving parts? So the municipality, the neighborhood groups, the province, the various parts of the province that get involved, because enforcement's environments and policy is FLNRO, Forest Lands Natural Resource Operations, Rural Development. So how do you keep it all in your head? And how do we explain to people that it should be simple, but it's not?
I mean, I think here on the North Shore, we've got this opportunity here where the North Shore Black Bear Society, we can provide education. We can be there if somebody calls us to let us know there's bear activity in the area. We can be there sometimes the same day to canvass that neighborhood and give people that information that they need to know. When it comes to calling conservation officers, there are about 5 conservation officers that cover the whole sea to sky corridor. That's from Maple Ridge to Pemberton. They serve 5 million people. And they're dealing with pollution, illegal trapping, all the other wildlife. So having a direct, when anybody calls them, having some kind of direct response from them usually only comes too late in the day when they have to then come and they say destroy the animal, we say kill that animal. So people, it's hard for the public to know who to call to get the information that they need. For us, we've got a working relationship with the Conservation Officer Service. We have a meeting with the municipal staff, and we have strong ties with solid waste here on the North Shore and our bylaw officers, and we work together and we share information. Getting that information shared effectively and timely is definitely an issue. I know we're trying to get information from conservation officers, how many bears have been killed this year on the North Shore, and sometimes that information, it can take months to get to us, but really we need to have that information so that we can share that with the residents here. And so what happened in April was that a bear was killed on the North Shore in the Lynn Valley neighborhood. He was accessing garbage and bird seed for 2 weeks, and the conservation officers came in and killed that bear. That was in the newspaper. That really got everybody's attention. If we can keep getting those stories in the newspaper in a timely manner, that might help people to start taking some action. So just being able to communicate with all these different agencies and such and doing it in a timely manner so people have got the information. and can take action immediately is really important. It's something that we're always working towards.
For sure. And that's getting information to people is exceptionally difficult. And I can even, so you're talking about how many conservation officers are there right now? 100 maybe? Do you have any idea? Neither of us are good at this. Let's just guess.
I'm not sure, but I know only around 5 permanent conservation officers work that sea to sky corridor, which includes Squamish, Whistler, Pemberton, all those really high population bear areas. So really, really don't have enough conservation officers.
Well, yeah, I just did a quick Google search, and the first result, which we're going to trust is the right one because it's from the Government of BC site, but there's only about 150 for the entire province. And while our challenges with the COS and our criticisms of how they operate are well documented, one of the things we always say is they need more funding, bottom line, because that's not enough people on the ground to respond to these.
Yeah, they don't have any opportunity to do any kind of education. They don't have the resources and time to do that. They don't have time to relocate bears. They don't have.
Well, and let's talk about relocation, because that's one that comes up a lot. And we'll talk about this both, and I'll put out the context that neither of us are biologists. I don't think you're a biologist, are you? I'm definitely not a biologist. I have my GED on a box right next to me right now, so there's that. But it's a word that gets used so much. There's 2 words I want to talk about. There's relocation, then we're going to get to habituation, which is a whole different ball of wax. But when we talk about relocation, it is very, very difficult because, and I'll use my personal experience, and this is very probably similar in parts of Vancouver. Here in Hamilton, Toronto, people say, well, let's relocate them up to Northern Ontario, right? Whether it's a raccoon or a coyote, or there have been occasions for bears to get close to Toronto. And there's this idea that there is sort of a pristine wilderness that's not here that all the animals can go to and live happily. But relocation is different, species by species, region by region. And there is a lot of thought that has to go into relocation. So with black bears, is relocation a reasonable solution? Is it a temporary solution? Is it not a solution at all? How does it fall into that sort of spectrum?
Well, the argument really here in BC is that black bears aren't an endangered species, so the government doesn't put the time or money into relocating those animals. That's the bottom line. And too many people think they see a bear trap in West Vancouver, and that bear will be taken, as you say, to this magical wilderness area where there are no people around. It just doesn't happen. I'm all for relocation, absolutely. I think that, the conservation officers will say there are only a few certain areas on the North Shore that bears can be released, and those watershed areas where they do release bears, they have limits. I think it's about 3 bears that can be relocated into that area, so areas to take bears are very limited, of course, but who are we to say that the bears can't sort out those issues? And that's the thing, it's like, we can't take too many bears to this area, it'll become overpopulated, there'll be too many bears, they'll die of starvation, they'll get into conflict. Well, I think that we should give them the opportunity to sort that out themselves. People have done enough damage, we should be moving the bears and letting them decide.
Absolutely. And before we ever get to that point, though, there's 2 big steps that need to take place. One is removing attractants, and 2 is or I shouldn't say 2 is, I'm asking, is there a 2? So, for example, with many creatures, we will have that sort of the group, and my colleague Leslie Sampson at Coyote Watch Canada talks about the 4 cornerstones of her coexistence program. Which I think is really the best way to put it. But you can't just have education, you can't just have enforcement, and you can't just have prevention. You have to have all of them working together. So when we talk about these situations, the first step is attractants, and we can dive more deeply into that, because I heard about your presentation at Coquitlam the other night, and you had a couple of interesting points I want to touch on. But again, it's tangents. I'm telling you, I'm all about the tangents. So So we remove attractants, but then when the bear comes around, so this is sort of that in between. We remove attractants, we tell people don't feed the wildlife, we get rid of everything. Bear comes around, or the bear's just hanging out in the backyard. Can we do anything to say, hey bear, this probably isn't the best place for you, without having to intervene in a violent means? And by violent means, excuse me, by violent means I mean, sedation and transportation, killing, things like that.
Yeah, I heavily influence residents, to try to influence residents from a safe place, I stress safe place, from a deck or an open window. If a bear is traveling in your yard or is in your yard, just traveling through, they've not found a bird feeder or anything like that, please discourage them from being on your property. You can be very loud, you can sound an air horn if you have one. If you live somewhere where bears are wandering through the neighborhood on a regular basis, it's very effective to throw water balloons close to them. Mm-hmm. Spray them with water. Just be very loud, make them feel very uncomfortable. The problem is, and this is becoming a huge problem, is this need to get a photograph and a video of everything that we see. Killing wildlife. The bears that we've got issues with here on the North Shore, they've been accessing food. So this is in an area, it's called Rice Lake. It's a really nice trail up in Lynn Valley. And what was happening in this area is that there's a really popular biking trail. And on that biking trail, you go very deep into the forest, and that's bear habitat. Everybody sees the new little bear cub. They're approaching the bear cub to take photographs. This bear feels very comfortable around people. The next year, he's a teenager, he's a bit bigger, and suddenly people are frightened. But he has no reason to be afraid of people because people have made him feel so comfortable. Mm-hmm. He then starts approaching people. People drop their food. Okay, as much as we tell people not to do that, so many people, when they see a bear, will drop their food and run. And so bears learn very quickly. They're very intelligent. If they approach people, they'll just drop their food for me. No problem. No conflict. I don't have to get into a fight. I don't have to be aggressive. These bears aren't displaying any kind of aggressive behavior whatsoever, but they're finding food rewards because they're comfortable around people, and we've let them feel comfortable around people. And I think photography, especially with smartphones, I think that's going to be a huge, huge problem for wildlife.
Oh, it already is.
Yeah.
And that's something I'll talk about with John Marriott and Carrie Martin, a couple of ethical photographers that I greatly enjoy that support us. And I've interviewed Parks Canada about this. Like outside of Banff and Jasper, they have bear jams where there's a bear on the side of the road and everybody and their brother pulls over to get out and take pictures. I saw, and it was either last year or the year before, and you may know exactly what I'm talking about. I'm pretty sure I wrote about it. There's a picture of a tourist 8 feet from a large black bear, which is eating some grass, and he's got his camera out trying to take pictures.
Right.
And I look at that and I go, like, that's a dead bear at this point.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Because whether it's walking up to cars, which can hit them, or, just getting close to people, like it's not going to be good. But everybody wants that quick shot. They want to be a part of it and take it home. And it's a very, very difficult conversation to have in a Royal Botanical Gardens park around here, where I've been taking excuse me, my little brother to do some bird photography, brendansbirds.com if you're interested. And the people feeding chipmunks, and it sounds silly. And I went off on a couple of people wildly inappropriately because I got frustrated with them. But they're sitting there and they're feeding chipmunks. They bring their kids, they bring peanuts and dried fruits and things like that. And the chipmunks come right up to them. They try and pet them and get the picture. Walking through that trail on a Friday afternoon, I almost stepped on several chipmunks. Like, they are underfoot. They are so comfortable with people. They follow you. They run up to your foot. And all it takes is for one of them to bite someone, which will happen eventually. And we're going to have a problem. And this is happening literally like 3 kilometers down the road, coyotes are going to show up and say, look at the buffet you've created for me. Exactly.
Yeah, that's what we talk about a lot, is that, people feed the birds, and that's fine. Bird feeders, they're my personal nemesis. I think they're killing bears. You can feed bears. There's not feed bears, never feed bears. You can feed the birds, but there are responsible ways that you can do that. But as soon as you start feeding anything else, you invite prey species into the neighborhood. And that's what we say. You get tons of rats, then you get coyotes coming down, then you get cougars. All those animals are going to get killed as well if they're in the neighborhood. If cougar is sighted in the neighborhood and it stays because there is an abundance of big fat raccoons that are being fed, that cougar is going to be killed. It's just, people don't understand. And lots of people, when they feed in wildlife, it comes from a good place. Mm-hmm. They want to help the animal. Lots of people just want a photo, of course. But we've also got people that intentionally feed wildlife just for that Instagram shot. Did you see the family in West Vancouver last year that were caught feeding an open window?
Yep.
Now, I went on their social media before it was made private, and they've been feeding bears for years, for 3 years at least, making pots of macaroni and cheese, feeding them crackers through the window in the plastic. You don't do that if you love wildlife, do you? You don't feed an animal plastic. So we've got all these different attitudes towards feeding wildlife, and it's a huge, huge challenge.
Yeah, and
people don't understand when they feed a little chipmunk that it escalates, right? As you said, it brings larger animals into the neighborhood.
Well, yeah, and that's just it. And I'm trying to come up with a couple of ideas for signage that I'm going to offer to pay for at this park in particular that talks about the consequence of feeding wildlife, because I think that's the problem is they see, oh, there's a bylaw. Well, if it's a bylaw, worst case, we get a $50 fine or someone gives us a stern look, right? That's the worst case if we get caught doing this. Because it's not taken seriously. And that's the phrasing I've had a lot of times is you can't have education without enforcement. So to have all of this stuff talking about don't feed wildlife, don't feed wildlife, don't feed wildlife, if we're not going out and actively fining people for feeding wildlife, then saying don't feed wildlife is meaningless.
Absolutely. I'm all for enforcement. Provide the education. If people don't change their habits or their attitudes, then enforcement is the way. Many, many places are having high success in reducing wildlife in the community because they're heavily enforcing their solid waste bylaws. Mm-hmm. It works. People don't want to pay $1,000 fine more than once.
I think they typically don't want to pay it at all, but
yeah.
Now, one of the things I want to talk about, and I've actually asked a couple of people to look at this, one person so far, the word habituation. It is a difficult word because at first glance, it makes perfect sense, but it gets used as a blanket term in my experience, particularly when we talk about bears and coyotes and stuff. And it actually doesn't tell us a lot. And I'm trying to think of an analogy for it. It would sort of be like saying the car is moving forward, but not giving you any indication of its speed. It doesn't give us any context for what's happening. So to say a bear is habituated or garbage habituated, well, what exactly does that mean? So let's start with when we hear that phrase, what is usually the intent behind it?
When we're hearing that phrase habituated, that is usually mentioned when a bear is killed. So the bear is habituated, which is supposed to mean it's too comfortable around people. It's not fearful of people anymore. And that gets a bear killed here in British Columbia. That's enough for a bear to be killed. So bears don't have to display any kind of aggressive behavior. They just have to not run away when they're being hazed. But as I say all the time, because there are so many more people living here, I'm talking about the North Shore and I guess all parts of Canada, people like me coming and invading and we're expanding and we're building onto their habitat. And so there are more people. Animals are adapting. Black bears are incredibly intelligent, and so they're adapting to increase human, dog, and car activity in their environment. If they ran away every time they encountered a person, they'd have no energy left to survive. So those methods of trying to scare a bear away that's on your property, they might not work. And we tell people that, 10 years ago, the bears would probably run away, but now they're just having to become more tolerant to all the human noises and smells and sounds that we make. So just being habituated, just not being fearful. But we're not teaching the bears to be fearful of us. The bears in the neighborhood, and we're either leaving a food reward or we're taking a photograph. Is anybody actually telling the bears to go away? Is anybody hazing the bears? No. Yeah. And that's why they're not afraid. They don't need to be afraid of us.
And I've heard a couple of people, I've not heard, I have read online a couple of commentators saying there's no evidence that hazing works. This is typically in the context of coyotes, but it's the same principle at play, that you're making an animal uncomfortable to the point that they will leave, and repeating that to the point that they just say, I'm going to avoid this to begin with. So can we say hazing works definitively, or is it a tool in the toolbox that should be used? And does it matter if it works definitively if we know sometimes it does?
Oh, we should always be trying non-lethal methods to deter wildlife from being in the community. Absolutely. That should always be the first step. Absolutely, it should. And bears are quick to learn. If we make them feel uncomfortable in the neighborhood, and we keep doing that, and the messaging is consistent, and that's the issue, right? They go to somebody's house, they scream and panic, the next person's taking photographs, the next person, they get a food reward, so they're just getting all these mixed messages from residents, and it's confusing to them. But at the end of the day, the food reward is what they're looking for.
It's Oh, I'm sorry, I was just going to say, it's remarkably like counter surfing for a dog.
Oh, yeah? I'm a cat person.
Okay. So dogs,
what's that mean?
Yeah, they just jump up and try and get whatever's on a counter. And
right,
the problem is it's an instant reward. So you can't, like, it's like trying to prove a negative. The only way to really stop it effectively is to not have anything there for them to get. So it's a very similar thing, is if one time that bear comes through 5 backyards and finds food, then that's one time it worked, so it may work again. It's a very simple logic.
Oh, yeah.
That they follow, I think. And like I said, it's a very clear, to me, it's very clear in terms of comparing it to dogs or cats, if you're training cats at all. We reward them for doing things we don't want them to do, or we reward them for doing things we do want them to do, and try and redirect them from things we don't want them to do.
Yeah.
And it's the exact same lesson, just applied a little differently. But I think it's just sometimes just the size of a black bear is scary to people.
Oh, absolutely. And the movies have done wonderful things to increase our imagination on how aggressive bears are and such. And that's one thing that we work on, is taking away the irrational fear of bears. I must admit that when I moved here, I was so desperate to see a bear. I was out all times of day and night looking for one for the first year I was here, but I was terrified to have a close encounter. And then I had my first close encounter, and I was so underwhelmed. I was like, oh, is that it? The bear barely paid any interest towards me whatsoever. It is not how I imagined it was going to be. And I think until people have had a few close encounters with bears and they realize that black bears especially are not interested in being close to people. They're not interested in being around people. They're not sat waiting in bushes to attack people. They're sat in bushes hiding from us. And I think when people learn more about bears and more about their behavior, we can try and take away the irrational fears. I've got a healthy respect for them. I'm not some crazy bear hugger, but, this fear of bears is something that we're really trying to take away from residents, because that, again, is what's getting them killed.
Absolutely. And like I said, it's the same thing with dogs. It's the same thing with coyotes. It's any animal that is perceived to be a threat. And again, I really want to put the mustard on the word perceived in that statement. The immediate concern is someone come take care of this problem. And I had a brilliant thought, and now it's gone. It just vanished. That's okay. That happens from time to time. Moving forward, 4,500 calls in all of 2018 regarding black bears and grizzly bears. And we are seeing in yesterday's news, so this is because we're in the past and we're doing a weird time jump thing. I'm referencing June 12th by Lin Young. More bear reports in BC in May than in the last 9 years. So for all of 2018, there was 4,500 calls. But just last month, it's 3,240 calls.
Yikes.
I don't understand why we are not changing the way we're doing things as a society. Yeah, I mean, that's the only way I can go with this point is it's people are calling it in more. There's more people, there's less space. There's probably roughly the same number of bears. It's not rocket science to figure out that bears are looking for places to live, just like we are. So I really do think that reducing the fear around them. I remembered what I was going to bring up. There it is. I had to circle around to it. I'm very professional, don't worry. One of the comments that comes up a lot, and I'm sure it's one that you deal with, and I'd love to hear your response, is, well, we have to make a choice between people and bears. And this is, it's a weird statement because it's never there's a room. We have one bullet and one person has to die. There's a bear and a human. Who do you choose? That's not the situation we're talking about. We're talking about there's a bear in the neighborhood and someone killed it without necessarily doing any prevention or hazing or things like that. Mm-hmm. And the comment comes forward of, well, if it's between people and bears, we have to pick people. How do you respond to that, or do you respond to that when it gets said?
I've actually not had that directed at me, personally, actually. Most of the people that I speak to that will approach us at our display booths at community events very much see where we live as the bear's home, and we are guests here, which is great. But I know, of course, that's the minority of people that we get come into the display, and there are many residents that see it the other way around. It's very precautionary, isn't it, when it comes to killing bears? It's what if. Mm-hmm. And very, very, very rarely do black bears make any kind of physical contact with anything. Okay, these bears aren't being killed because they're being aggressive. They're being killed literally for just being present in an urban environment. And that's what I've got an issue with.
Yeah,
take the attractants away, the bear will leave. They have no reason to hang around in an urban environment if there's no food for them. They don't deserve to be killed just for walking through a neighborhood, which in most cases here on the North Shore, that neighborhood's going to be attached to a green space or a creek. It's a natural environment for wildlife to travel through.
Yeah, I think that's always the thing that hits people funny when you're reading this online, especially when you're not in the community where it happened. Because the first thing I do is I look up where it is when I see some incident, regardless of it. I pull it up on maps. So if there was a bear in my neighborhood, you would look and you'd see very little green, right? I'm in the middle of a dense urban center. I'm a 2-minute walk from a football stadium. There's steel mills in the distance. Like if you saw a bear here, you'd go, wow, why is there a bear there? People even say that about raccoons around here because there's such little green space right where we are. But when you then look at some of these communities, it's 10 houses wedged between like a provincial park and a great big green space. And they're complaining about the presence of wildlife.
Oh, I know. Like there's a huge area of houses here that back on to a regional park. And the number of complaints about wildlife from that area is astonishing. And people say to me how they live near Grass Mountain, as high as you can get, as high as the houses go, next to Capilano Regional Park, next to a huge river. And they ask me how to keep the bears away always. How do we keep them always at a certain distance and away from this area? And we just have to say, of course, keep all your wildlife attractants. We go through all the spiel of wildlife attractants. But at the end of the day, you have chosen to live on a mountain, next to a river, next to a forest. And that's where bears live.
Yeah.
So people have got the choice, for the most part, to be able to move away to a different environment where there might be less wildlife that they're afraid of. But bears don't have a choice. They've got a limited space to live. They need a certain environment, and that forest is the environment that they need.
One of the things that you mentioned, and I want to talk about solutions now that we've dished a bit about people not listening to us. But by the way, when I'm King of Canada, I'll make you in charge of the Bears for BC. How about that?
Sure thing. Okay. Sounds good.
Yeah. I still got to figure out the paperwork on it, but I'm working towards it. You were talking about bird feeders, and This is always a difficult conversation to have because people love feeding birds. It is a huge hobby. It is part of an industry. Like I go to Bulk Barn to buy my wheat gluten and nooch and stuff, and they've got an entire aisle of bird seed and stuff like that.
Oh yeah, I know. I'm not popular when I say I don't like bird feeders, but not as the people, the actual physical bird feeder.
Yes. Well, I think people they take it as an affront. And that's actually circling back to my issue in this one park near here. There's people will take food for birds and chipmunks and stuff, but then they also throw that same food to waterfowl. So geese, ducks, swans, whom will die if they eat too much of that food. So there's also that issue. But anyway, people will often, when they are really dug in, try and find a compromise, right? They're going to say, I'm not going to stop feeding the birds. I've been feeding the birds for 40 years. So in that case, and this actually comes up, it's the exact same question I've asked Leslie Sampson from Coyote Watch Canada and others who work in these similar kind of positions as you. What is a compromise? So we're not just talking about everyone with a bird feeder, but we're specifically saying there are bears in the community. There are complaints happening. What is a solution that doesn't necessarily mean getting rid of everything?
Well, I think when it comes to feeding the birds, it's pretty simple. And we just say, leave some food out for them on a plate when you're home to enjoy watching them. Take it in once they've gone and once the food is gone, and clear anything up that they've scattered around. Of course, that's going to attract rats, which then you get coyotes, of course, and the bears will come for the bird feeders. I always call them bear feeders, bird feeders. And I think that's the solution. People can still feed the birds, but we're not leaving bird feeders out. And it doesn't matter what time of year. We're getting reports of bears accessing bird feeders over the winter. So many organizations, they say don't put bird feeders up during bear season. But bear season's changing, and that's because we're leaving our natural food sources out for them. We've had bears that have been active all year round on the North Shore, surviving on bird feeders and garbage. So I think lots of people, they will get in touch and say, when is it okay to put my bird feeders up? And in the past, we've said over the winter, typically like December, January, February is fine. But I kind of want to change that, and I want people to know that we can't become complacent over the winter because bears' habits are changing because of what we're doing to help them stay awake all winter.
Yeah, that's again one of those little influences. I read an article about actually bird populations changing, as well as the possibility of small adaptations. So we're seeing a microcosm of evolution and I think it was in Britain, a certain bird species had actually developed a longer, thinner beak because it was helping them get an advantage at bird feeders.
Wow! Oh my goodness!
Right, like that's over the course of several decades, but still, evolution typically happens like in eons, right? We're not talking a dozen, 24 generations. So it's interesting when that happens, but that's also similar to like certain species of fish adapting to be smaller because they can get out of nets, right? And pass on genes, and bighorn sheep growing smaller horns because the ones who have the biggest horns often get killed for trophies. And so the ones left to reproduce will be the ones who naturally have smaller horns. It's a very interesting thing and another tangent, and nothing to do with bears. So next question that does have to do with bears is about bear bells. This is something that Marcy, our director of operations, very furiously typed to me during your presentation. And like there was capital letters all over the place and exclamation marks. And yeah, I know, right? I was affronted. I was deeply concerned by the way she texted me, but
what did she say?
It was more like bear bells don't work, 8 exclamation marks. Lucy said so, stuff like that. A couple of curse words, probably, knowing Marcy. She's terrible. So bear bells, that's something that for a long time, everyone said, well, make sure you have your bear bell. Make sure you have your bear bell. And there is a very clear logic. As you wear a little bell, bears hear you coming, they leave you alone. But what we're hearing now from people like yourself and other experts is that bear bells may not be really helping at all.
Yep, they've not proven to be effective. Of course, it's always best to make some noise when you're in the forest. That will deter wildlife. It will alert wildlife to human presence. But the best tool that you have is actually a human voice. Black bears are smart. They recognize our human voices. If they hear a human, they will usually hide in a tree or leave the area. They don't want to be close to us. So using your voice is the best way to alert bears, especially that people are around. Those bells, they're actually not very loud. Mm-hmm. You can wear a bear bell on your bike. That's definitely going to help, but you also need to be much, much louder if you're biking. We have so many stories of mountain bikers crashing into bears because they're so fast and they're so quiet. So especially if you're on your bike, you need to be using your voice a lot more and to be a lot louder. But actually what's been reported, and there are some reports saying that bears, especially in the national parks, what they're doing is they're learning that that signal of that bear bell is a signal of a food reward. It is like a dinner bell. Lots of people, they go out backpacking in bear country and they just grab a bear bell on the way and think that that's enough to deter wildlife. And those are the people, too, that they don't know what to do when they encounter a bear. And so they do what I said before, they drop their pack, their food reward, mm-hmm. and then they leave. And so the bear learns, I hear the bear bell, I can walk up to that hiker and they'll probably drop their pack and give me a meal. I
think Yogi Bear did that a couple of times, like legitimately. So, yeah, that checks out.
And it just makes sense. Plus that it is such a quiet sound. If you've got a big cowbell and you're making a bunch of noise, that's different. But your voice is the best tool. And you won't forget your voice, but you might forget your bear bell. So.
That's true. Although all of the people in my life are probably going to want your phone number to complain about you telling me to talk more. So just bear that in mind. I made a joke. I didn't even mean to. Because I said bear that in mind.
Oh, I'm always doing that without realizing. Kids think it's hilarious.
Yeah, it's fun. I like
I think barely a lot.
The bear word, the word bear is fun. I'm just confusing myself now by talking. How can people be part of the solution in their community? I think that's where we should leave off is every situation's different to some degree. There's lots of context. There's lots of little minute differences. But if we want to just sort of give general advice to people at large across Canada, specifically British Columbia, of course, but really across Canada, when it comes to coexisting with black bears, what are some of the big things that they can do in their communities or at their houses to make a difference?
Well, the biggest, strongest attractant for black bears in the community is garbage. So keeping your garbage in a secure place. And so the bear was killed in West Vancouver a couple of weeks ago because the garbage was in a garage, but the garage just had a very flimsy panel that the bear was able to push over, and then the bear's then in a confined space and was then killed by conservation officers. So keeping your garbage in a secure place, keeping your carts very clean, washing them as often as possible. And bleach, something like that, bleach or ammonia, not together, of course, but something that's not sweet smelling, no lemon scents, anything like that could then attract wildlife. Freezing your odorous organics. We do that at our house, and it helps you be very mindful of the waste, food waste that you might be creating. And it also reduces any smell in your home or in your apartment. So we just freeze odorous organics in a plastic box lined with newspaper, and we put everything out on the very morning of collection. So if you don't have a bylaw for that, I still think that people should be trying to get members of their community to be doing that, because having garbage out overnight, accessible to wildlife when there's nobody available to deter them from a safe space. Everyone's fast asleep, and it's a buffet for the bears then if all the garbage carts are out. So adhering to solid waste bylaws, absolutely, that reduces wildlife activity in the community. Taking down those bird feeders, picking your fruit trees. Fruit trees are the second strongest attractant for bears in the community. And if you're going to have chickens or bees, or if you've got many, many fruit trees, consider electric fencing. It's the only way to deter wildlife from accessing those things. So electric fencing now is becoming much more affordable, has to be maintained properly, of course, but it's a very, very effective way. Keeping your chickens or your bees safe, and bears away from the community. And then speaking to your neighbors and speaking to any new neighbors that are coming in and letting them know that we've got bears here. Many people don't realize that we've got bears on the North Shore until the bear's in their garbage. So we've got all these people moving from other places that aren't used to living with wildlife. And I would love if more residents took responsibility to introduce their neighbors to bear country.
To learn more about the North Shore Black Bear Society, look them up on social media for great content or visit northshorebears.com. I'd also love to hear about your successful experiences in ending conflict with wildlife in your community. You can hit me up on social media at Defender Radio or at Howie Michael on Instagram. You can send me an email at michael@thefurbears.com or just tag Defender Radio Podcast in your posts and I should see it. I'll be back next week with some news about young defenders, more interviews with more experts for Defender Radio, and a relentless stream of adorable dog photos on my Instagram. Until next time, I'm Michael Howie for Defender Radio, reminding you to be kind and to stay informed and stay strong.